The child did not understand why the whole ranch had gone silent when he stepped onto the porch. He only knew that Mrs. Whitaker would not look at him, Mr. Whitaker's hands were shaking, and the hired men standing near the fence stared at him as though he had brought shame into the yard instead of simply carrying a small bundle of clothes and a soldier's old letter tied with string. His name was Joseph, though some in town refused to use it. To them, he was only the Indian boy living on land they believed did not belong to him. By sundown, the ranch owner ordered him off the property, and not one man stepped forward to stop it. Joseph stood alone beside the split-rail fence with dust on his boots, fear in his throat, and the letter clutched against his chest. He could not read all the words. He only knew the soldier who wrote it had promised he would never be abandoned. But promises were fragile things in a town ruled by fear. Then Pastor Elias Monroe picked up the fallen letter, saw the signature at the bottom, and turned pale as if a dead man had spoken from the page. Joseph Whitaker stood beside the barn door with a cloth bundle in one hand and an old letter in the other, while the whole ranch watched him as if he had suddenly become a stranger. The morning sun rose over the Wyoming hills, spreading gold across the pasture, the water trough, the corral, and the long line of fence posts that had once marked the only home he could remember. For 7 years, he had slept beneath the Whitaker roof. For 7 years, he had helped feed chickens, carry kindling, brush horses, and gather eggs before dawn. For 7 years, Mrs. Ruth Whitaker had called him to supper with the same tired tenderness she used for any child under her care. Yet that morning, her mouth trembled, and no words came. Her husband, Thomas Whitaker, stood near the porch steps with his hat in his hands, staring at the dirt. Around them waited hired men, neighbors, 2 riders from the county office, and Silas Crow, the wealthy ranch owner, whose cattle had been spreading across smaller farms like storm clouds. Joseph did not understand all of it. He understood only the parts that hurt. The Whitakers owed money. Silas Crow wanted their land. And somehow, the easiest way to break the family was to begin with the child nobody in town wished to defend. Crow sat tall in the saddle, his black coat clean, his gray mustache trimmed, his eyes cold with the confidence of a man used to turning human sorrow into business. "The boy leaves today," he said. Mrs. Whitaker made a small sound, almost a plea, but Thomas placed one hand gently over hers. Joseph looked from face to face, searching for someone who might tell him this was a mistake. Nobody did. The county writer unfolded a document and read words Joseph barely understood about disputed guardianship, improper adoption, public concern, ranch debt, and the welfare of the child. Welfare. Joseph had heard Pastor Monroe use that word in church once, and it had sounded kind then. Now it sounded like a rope. "I belong here," Joseph whispered. Silas Crow looked down at him. "No, boy, you were kept here." The words made several people shift uncomfortably, but discomfort was not courage. Joseph tightened his fingers around the letter tied with string. It was the only thing he had from before the Whitakers. The paper had yellowed. The folds were worn soft. The ink had faded in places. Mrs. Whitaker once told him it came from the soldier who carried him to the ranch when he was small, a soldier with blood on his sleeve and desperation in his eyes. Joseph did not know the man's full story. He only knew the letter mattered because Mrs. Whitaker always kept it wrapped in cloth inside the Bible until last night, when she pressed it into his hands and told him never to let anyone take it. Silas Crow noticed the letter. His eyes narrowed. "What's that?" Joseph pulled it closer to his chest. Mrs. Whitaker stepped forward quickly. "Nothing of yours." Crow smiled without warmth. "Everything on this ranch is nearly mine." Thomas finally looked up, shame and anger fighting across his face. "Not the child." Crow leaned slightly forward in the saddle. "Then prove he is yours." Silence fell over the yard. A horse stamped near the fence. Wind moved through the dry grass. Joseph looked at Thomas, waiting for the answer that would save him, but the old farmer's eyes filled with helpless grief. The law had never been written with boys like Joseph in mind. It had words for property, debt, title, cattle, pasture, and boundary lines. It had few words for a child left in wartime, raised by love and judged by skin before truth. One of Crow's men stepped toward Joseph. The boy backed away. "Mrs. Whitaker cried out, But Thomas held her back because he knew armed men were waiting for any excuse. Joseph's bundle slipped from his hand and fell open in the dirt, spilling a spare shirt, a wooden horse Thomas had carved for him, and a small blue blanket patched at the corners. The hired man reached for the letter. Joseph turned sharply, and the string snapped. The pages fluttered to the ground. Before Crow's man could grab them, a voice came from beyond the fence. "Leave that be." Everyone turned. Pastor Elias Monroe stood at the gate with a worn Bible under one arm and dust on the hem of his black coat. He was not a large man nor a young one, but something in his voice made even Crow's riders pause. The pastor entered the yard slowly, his eyes moving from Joseph's fallen bundle to Mrs. Whitaker's tears, and finally to the old letter lying open in the dust. "Pastor," Crow said, forcing a polite tone, "this is county business." Elias looked at him calmly. "Then it can stand a witness." He bent and lifted the letter before anyone could stop him. Joseph watched anxiously, afraid the pastor might hand it over. Instead, Elias unfolded the page and began reading silently. At first his expression remained composed, then his face changed. The color drained from his cheeks. His hand tightened around the paper. He read one line again, then another, then lowered his eyes to the signature at the bottom. For a moment the whole ranch seemed to hold its breath. Crow noticed. "Give me that letter." Pastor Monroe did not move. His voice came quietly, but it carried across the yard. "Where did this child get this?" "Mrs." Whitaker wiped her face with trembling fingers. "A soldier brought it with him." Elias looked at Joseph then, truly looked at him, as if seeing not an unwanted child but the answer to a question buried for years. "What soldier?" Thomas swallowed hard. "Captain Daniel Reeves." The pastor closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again, grief stood in them like an old ghost. Daniel Reeves died believing this promise had been kept. Silas Crow's jaw tightened. "That paper changes nothing." Elias folded the letter carefully and held it against his chest. "No, Mr. Crow." His voice hardened. "It may change everything." Joseph did not understand why the pastor looked so shaken. He did not understand why Crow's hand moved toward his reins as though he suddenly wished to leave. He did not understand why Mrs. Whitaker began sobbing harder, or why Thomas stared at the letter as if it had become a judgment. He only understood that for the first time that terrible morning, someone had picked up what belonged to him and refused to surrender it. Then Pastor Monroe looked toward the hill beyond the ranch, where the old cemetery rested beneath 3 cottonwoods, and whispered words Joseph would remember for the rest of his life. "Before anyone sends this child away, we must open Captain Reeves's grave." No one at the Whitaker ranch moved after Pastor Elias Monroe said they must open Captain Daniel Reeves's grave. Even the horses seemed to feel the weight of his words, standing still beside the split-rail fence while the wind stirred dust across the yard and carried the smell of dry grass down from the hills. Joseph stood with his small bundle at his feet and the soldier's letter now held safely in the pastor's trembling hands. He did not understand why the grave mattered. He did not understand why Mr. Crow's eyes had gone cold in a different way, less certain and more dangerous. He understood only that the pastor had seen something in the letter no one else had ever told him, and whatever it was had frightened the man who had come to take him away. Silas Crow slowly dismounted, his boots striking the dirt with deliberate calm. "Pastor Monroe," he said, voice careful, "I believe grief has clouded your judgment." Elias did not look at him. His eyes remained fixed on the letter. "Grief has done many things to this town, Mr. Crow, but today it may have uncovered what fear buried." Thomas Whitaker raised his head at that, hope and dread crossing his face together. Ruth Whitaker moved closer to Joseph, though one of Crow's men shifted as if to stop her. The pastor saw the motion and folded the letter into his coat. "Touch the boy again, and I will name every man here from the pulpit on Sunday." The hired man froze. It was not a threat of violence, but in a town where reputation fed credit, contracts, marriage prospects, and burial rights, the pulpit could strike harder than a rifle. Crow smiled thinly. "You would turn a church into a courtroom?" Elias finally looked at him. "No, I would turn it back into a church." The words passed through the yard like a hard wind. Several neighbors lowered their eyes. They had come expecting county business, perhaps even a spectacle, not a moral accounting. Crow understood the mood changing and disliked it. "There is no legal adoption," he said, "no proper guardianship, no court record giving these people lawful claim over that child." Elias's face remained calm, but his voice sharpened. Then why are you afraid of a dead soldier's letter? Crow said nothing for half a second too long. That half second was enough. Thomas noticed. Ruth noticed. Joseph noticed, though he could not have named what he saw. The pastor turned toward the hill, where the small cemetery lay beyond the cottonwoods. Captain Reeves was buried with his field Bible, his coat, and a sealed packet because the men who brought him home said he died before reaching my door. I was told the packet contained nothing of value. He looked back at Crow. But this letter says otherwise. Joseph's fingers tightened around the wooden horse spilled from his bundle. What packet? He whispered. Elias knelt before him then, careful not to tower over the boy as every other adult had done that morning. Captain Reeves wrote that he left proof with the dead because he feared the living would sell it. Joseph stared at him. Proof of what? The pastor's expression softened with pain. Of a promise made during the war. Before Joseph could ask another question, Crow stepped forward. Enough. This time the politeness had gone. No grave will be disturbed because an old preacher has lost his senses. Elias rose slowly. That grave is on church ground. The cemetery sits on land my ranch surrounds. Surrounding a thing does not make it yours. Crow's jaw tightened. For a moment the yard stood on the edge of violence. Then a rider appeared on the road leading from town, galloping hard enough to scatter chickens near the barn. He was young, dusty, and frightened, one of the boys who worked near the telegraph office. He pulled his horse short at the gate and looked toward the pastor. Reverend Monroe. Elias turned. What is it? The boy swallowed. A telegram came for Mr. Crow from Cheyenne. Crow's expression changed instantly. Give it here. The rider hesitated, glancing at the pastor, then at Joseph, then back at Crow. I was told to place it directly in your hand, sir. Crow snatched the envelope, broke it open, and read quickly. The words were private, but his reaction was not. His face hardened, then paled. His gaze moved briefly to Joseph, then to the letter hidden inside the pastor's coat. Elias saw it clearly. Whatever had arrived from Cheyenne was connected to the boy. Crow crushed the paper in one fist. This matter ends now, he said. The boy comes with me. Ruth stepped in front of Joseph before fear could stop her. No. The word came out small but firm. Thomas moved beside her. No, he repeated, stronger. Crow looked at the neighbors, expecting them to support him through silence, but silence had begun to change shape. A few men looked away. One removed his hat. Another stepped back from Crow's riders. The pastor lifted his voice just enough to carry. Joseph will remain under my protection until this is settled before God and proper witnesses. Crow laughed once. You have no authority. Elias held up the soldier's letter. I have a dead man's promise and a living child. That will do until sunrise. The standoff lasted another breath, then another. Crow understood he could still take Joseph by force, but doing so now meant turning private intimidation into public outrage. He mounted slowly, never taking his eyes from Elias. You are making a grave mistake, Pastor. Elias answered quietly. Then I will make it in daylight. Crow turned his horse toward the road, but before leaving he leaned down toward Joseph and spoke in a voice only the boy, Ruth, and Elias could hear. That letter will not make them love you. Then he rode away with his men behind him, carrying the crushed telegram in his fist like a secret burning through paper. Only when the riders disappeared beyond the ridge did Ruth collapse to her knees and pull Joseph into her arms. Thomas covered his face with both hands. The neighbors began drifting away in uneasy silence, each carrying a piece of what they had seen and none knowing what to do with it. Pastor Elias remained standing near the gate until the ranch yard emptied. Then he finally removed the letter from his coat and read the final paragraph aloud to Thomas and Ruth. Captain Daniel Reeves had written that the child was to be sheltered as kin, not charity, that his mother had saved the lives of 3 soldiers during a winter retreat, and that Reeves had sworn before 2 witnesses to protect her son if she did not survive the fighting along the northern trail. Joseph listened without understanding why the words made Ruth sob harder. My mother? He asked. Elias folded the letter with care. Her name was Ayanna. The name moved through Joseph like distant music, familiar and strange at once. No one had spoken it to him before. Was she bad? The question broke something in Ruth. No, she whispered. No, child. Elias's eyes filled with old grief. She was brave. Thomas looked toward the cemetery hill. And Reeves put proof in the grave? Elias nodded. That is what the letter says. Thomas swallowed. If Crow wants it hidden, he'll move before morning. The pastor looked toward the darkening road where the ranch owner had vanished. Yes. Then he turned back to the Whitakers. Which is why Joseph comes with me tonight. Ruth immediately tightened her arms around the boy. Elias softened his voice. Not away from you. To protect him. Thomas understood before Ruth did. Their ranch was surrounded. Their debt had made them vulnerable. Crow could return after nightfall with men who would not care about witnesses. The church, at least, stood in town. It had doors, a bell, and enough eyes nearby to make secrecy difficult. After several tearful minutes, Ruth helped Joseph gather his bundle. She tucked the patched blue blanket back inside, placed the carved wooden horse beside it, and kissed the boy's forehead as if sending him into a storm. Joseph wanted to ask whether he would come back, but fear kept the question trapped behind his teeth. Pastor Elias took his small hand, and together they walked toward town as sunset burned orange across the hills. The road felt longer than it ever had. Joseph kept looking back until the Whitaker ranch disappeared behind the rise. The pastor did not hurry him. Sometimes a child needed to watch a home vanish in order to believe it had truly been taken. By the time they reached the church, lanterns glowed in several windows across town, and curious faces peered from behind curtains. Elias led Joseph through a side door into the small vestry behind the sanctuary. There, beneath a shelf of hymnals, he unlocked an iron box and placed Captain Reeves's letter inside. Then he paused, studying the bottom of the box. Something was wrong. The pastor removed several papers. Then a Bible. Then an old communion cloth. His face tightened. "What is it?" Joseph asked. Elias reached into the empty space and lifted out a torn strip of brown leather. This box was opened. Joseph looked at the leather. By who? Elias did not answer. The church bell rope creaked faintly overhead, though no wind moved inside the room. The pastor stepped toward the sanctuary and found the front doors still locked from within, yet muddy boot prints crossed the aisle leading straight toward the cellar stairs. Joseph moved closer to him, suddenly cold. Elias held the lantern high and whispered, "Stay behind me." Together they descended into the church cellar, where barrels of flour, old hymn benches, and winter blankets were stored in darkness. At the bottom of the stairs, the lantern light revealed fresh scratches across the dirt floor and an open crate that had not been opened that morning. Elias knelt beside it and drew out a second envelope, older than the first and sealed with black wax bearing Captain Reeves's initials. The intruder had not found it, or perhaps had not known where to look. Elias broke the seal with trembling hands. Inside was a single page and a small tintype photograph. The photograph showed Captain Reeves standing beside a native woman with calm eyes and a baby wrapped in a blue blanket. Joseph stared at the image, unable to breathe. The blue blanket in the photograph matched the one inside his bundle. On the back, written in the captain's hand, were 7 words. "If I die, take him home." Pastor Elias looked at the child beside him, then at the sealed cellar wall where an old stone had been pried loose just enough to reveal a hidden hollow behind it. His voice dropped to a whisper. "Joseph, this was never only about keeping you on the ranch. Outside, far beyond the church windows, a horse stopped in the alley and a shadow moved across the glass. Someone had followed them. The shadow outside the church window remained perfectly still for several long seconds, forcing Pastor Elias Monroe and Joseph to stand motionless in the dim cellar while the lantern flame trembled between them. Neither spoke. The silence itself seemed to listen. Joseph instinctively reached for the faded blue blanket folded beneath his arm, clutching it the way frightened children held onto the last familiar thing left in a world that no longer felt safe. Pastor Monroe slowly extinguished the lantern with 2 careful fingers, plunging the cellar into darkness broken only by thin moonlight slipping through narrow foundation vents. Above them, the old church settled with quiet creaks as the evening wind pressed gently against its wooden walls. Then came the sound again. A slow footstep across the sanctuary floor. Whoever had followed them had entered the church without forcing the door. Elias rested one hand on Joseph's shoulder, silently warning him not to move. The footsteps crossed the aisle overhead, paused briefly near the pulpit, then continued toward the staircase leading into the cellar. Joseph's heartbeat pounded so loudly he became certain the stranger could hear it. Every story older children had whispered about thieves, bounty hunters, and railroad gunmen returned at once. He wanted to ask whether they should run, but fear stole the words before they reached his lips. Pastor Monroe quietly reached beneath an old storage shelf and withdrew a worn cavalry revolver wrapped inside a faded cloth. Joseph had never seen the pastor carry a weapon before. Elias noticed the boy staring. "I prayed I would never need this again," he whispered. Before Joseph could answer, the cellar door above groaned open. A narrow beam of lamplight stretched down the staircase. Someone descended slowly. One step, then another. The stranger carried no lantern, only a small oil lamp that illuminated weathered boots and the hem of a dark traveling coat. Pastor Monroe raised the revolver but did not fire. As the figure reached the final step, an elderly voice spoke softly through the darkness. "If you're planning to shoot me, Elias, at least let me explain why I came." The pastor lowered the weapon immediately. "Samuel?" The man lifted the lamp, revealing a deeply lined face framed by white hair beneath a battered cavalry hat. Samuel Pierce had once served beside Captain Daniel Reeves during the final years of the Civil War, before becoming the circuit preacher responsible for dozens of isolated frontier churches. He was nearly 70 now, his shoulders bent with age, but his eyes remained remarkably sharp. Joseph watched as the two old ministers embraced without another word. When they finally separated, Samuel looked toward the frightened child standing behind Elias. The old preacher studied him quietly for several seconds before emotion softened his face. "You have your mother's eyes," he said. Joseph blinked. "You knew her?" Samuel nodded very slowly. "Long before you were born." Pastor Monroe quickly secured the cellar door behind them while Samuel placed his worn saddlebag upon an old crate. "You shouldn't have come after dark," Elias said. Samuel smiled faintly. "Neither should the men waiting outside." Joseph felt his stomach tighten. "There are more?" Samuel nodded. 4 riders. He looked toward the ceiling. 2 behind the stable. 1 beside the cemetery gate. Another watching the road. Elias frowned. Crow, without question. Samuel removed a folded newspaper from his coat before carefully placing it beside Captain Reeves's letter and the newly discovered photograph. He knows something survived. The old preacher unfolded the newspaper. Buried near the bottom of the second page appeared a short notice announcing that railroad investor Silas Crow intended to purchase the Whitaker property within 3 days following the removal of its current occupants. Elias frowned. "He moves quickly." Samuel looked directly at him. "Too quickly." He tapped the paper gently. "Men buying ordinary ranches don't send armed riders into churches." Joseph listened carefully without fully understanding. Adults kept speaking around him rather than to him, yet pieces slowly began fitting together. The ranch mattered. The letter mattered. Captain Reeves mattered. Somehow he mattered too. Samuel noticed the confusion in the boy's face and quietly knelt before him. "Joseph, has anyone ever told you why Captain Reeves carried you here?" The child slowly shook his head. Samuel drew a slow breath before answering. "Because your mother saved his life." The cellar fell completely silent. Even Pastor Monroe said nothing. Samuel continued quietly. Winter of 1865. Captain Reeves's patrol became trapped during a blizzard while escorting civilians across disputed territory. Horses died. Supplies disappeared. Half the men developed frostbite. He looked gently toward Joseph. "Your mother found them." Joseph barely whispered. "Ayanna." Samuel smiled sadly. "Yes." The old preacher's eyes drifted toward the faded photograph resting on the crate. She brought food, firewood, medicine. She hid wounded soldiers inside her village, despite knowing both armies might punish her people for helping strangers. Pastor Monroe lowered his eyes. He had heard fragments of the story before, but never the entire account. Samuel continued. "When raiders attacked several weeks later, Captain Reeves survived because your mother warned them before dawn." Joseph listened without blinking. "What happened to her?" Samuel remained silent for several painful moments. She stayed behind so the others could escape. The answer told Joseph everything it needed to. The boy looked quietly toward the floor. No tears came. The grief felt older than tears. Pastor Monroe gently unfolded Captain Reeves's letter once more. The promise. Samuel nodded. Daniel made it before 2 witnesses. He pointed toward the photograph. Me. Then he placed one weathered finger against his own chest. And me. Elias looked up sharply. You witnessed it? Samuel nodded. Every word. He closed his eyes briefly, as memory carried him backward more than 20 years. Daniel promised Ayanna that if she did not survive, her son would never grow up alone. Joseph stared at him. Then why didn't he stay? Samuel's face tightened with sorrow. Because he never reached home. Silence settled again. Joseph slowly understood. Captain Reeves had kept the promise as far as he could. The letter. The Whitakers. The photograph. Everything had been an attempt to honor a dying mother's wish. A loud knock suddenly echoed through the sanctuary above, then another. This one harder. Pastor Monroe looked toward the ceiling. Nobody inside the cellar moved. A familiar voice called through the church. Pastor Monroe. Silas Crow. I know you're awake. No answer came. Crow waited several seconds before speaking again. I've come for the boy. Samuel quietly reached into his saddlebag and withdrew another object wrapped in oilcloth. Pastor Monroe unfolded the bundle carefully. Inside rested Captain Reeves's military journal, its leather cover cracked with age, its brass clasp still intact. Elias looked at Samuel in complete surprise. Daniel's journal? Samuel nodded. He left it with me. The pastor looked from the journal to the soldier's letter already lying beside it. Why didn't you bring this years ago? Samuel's tired eyes filled with regret. Because Daniel ordered me not to. Joseph frowned. Why? Samuel answered softly. He believed powerful men would keep searching until they found every piece. He looked toward the church doors where Crow continued waiting outside. Tonight, they finally have. Another knock. Harder. Then the heavy sound of boots gathering on the church porch. Pastor Monroe carefully opened Captain Reeves's journal. Inside the front cover, written in steady military handwriting, appeared only one sentence. If this journal is opened, Joseph is finally old enough to know who he truly is. The words written inside Captain Daniel Reeves's military journal seemed to fill the church cellar more heavily than the sound of Silas Crow's men gathering above them. If this journal is opened, Joseph is finally old enough to know who he truly is. Pastor Elias Monroe read the sentence twice, then a third time, while Joseph stood beside him holding the old tintype photograph of Captain Reeves, Ayanna, and the baby wrapped in the same blue blanket now folded inside his bundle. Samuel Pierce remained near the stairs, listening to the boots crossing the sanctuary floor overhead. Outside, Crow's voice came again, colder now, stripped of the false politeness he had used at the Whitaker ranch. Pastor Monroe, open this door. Elias closed the journal gently, but Samuel shook his head and whispered, No, read. The pastor looked toward him sharply. Now? Now? Samuel said, If Crow breaks that door before we know what Daniel left, the truth may die in this cellar. Joseph did not understand why his hands had begun to tremble. Perhaps it was the men above them. Perhaps it was the picture of the woman named Ayanna. Perhaps it was the terrible feeling that grown men had fought over his life long before he knew enough to ask why. Elias opened the journal again while Samuel quietly lifted the old revolver and positioned himself halfway up the cellar stairs. The first pages contained ordinary military entries. Patrol routes. Weather. Names of wounded men. Notes about supply wagons, river crossings, and late winter storms along the northern trail. Then, halfway through the journal, the writing changed. Captain Reeves began describing a woman who appeared during a blizzard with food and medicine when his patrol had nearly frozen in a ravine, Ayanna. She knew the country better than any scout, spoke little English but understood suffering instantly, and guided the soldiers toward shelter when both their maps and pride had failed them. Joseph listened without breathing as the pastor read in a low voice. Reeves wrote that Ayanna's village had already suffered from broken agreements, stolen grazing lands, and soldiers who treated every native face as an enemy, Yet she still chose mercy when she found men dying in snow. He wrote that she carried her baby against her chest beneath a fur-lined wrap and sang softly whenever the wind grew cruel. He wrote that the child's name in her language meant Little Dawn, because he had been born just as first light broke across the plains after 3 nights of storm. Joseph touched the photograph with one finger. Little Dawn. The words felt strange and beautiful, like a door opening inside him to a place he had never seen but somehow missed. Above them, something struck the church door hard enough to shake dust from the ceiling. Samuel glanced back but did not move. Elias kept reading. The journal described the attack that came weeks later, not by Ayanna's people but by white raiders hired to clear families from contested valley land before spring surveying began. Reeves had written the accusation plainly. Silas Crow's name appeared in the margin beside the words, land, hunger, dressed as law. Joseph looked up immediately. Crow? Elias's face had gone pale. Samuel closed his eyes as if the name confirmed an old fear. Reeves's journal continued. Ayanna warned the patrol before dawn. Her warning saved the soldiers, but she did not flee with them at once. She returned for elders and children trapped near the creek. By the time Reeves found her again, she had been wounded. She placed her son into his arms and made him swear the boy would not be handed to men who would use law to erase blood, promise, and name. Elias's voice broke slightly as he read the next line. She asked me not to make him a symbol, only a son. Joseph stared at the page. A son. Not a burden. Not charity. Not a problem to be removed from land. A son. Outside, Crow shouted again, and this time wood cracked somewhere above. The church door would not hold long. Samuel descended 3 steps and spoke quickly. Daniel knew Crow wanted the valley. Elias turned another page. There, folded into the journal, lay a second map. Unlike the rough county maps Joseph had seen in the schoolhouse, this one had been drawn by hand with careful marks showing creeks, grazing paths, graves, cottonwoods, and a stretch of land running directly through what was now the Whitaker ranch. At the bottom, Reeves had written, "This land was promised as shelter, not sale. Ayanna's kin may return, and the boy must know the place where his mother stood." Elias looked toward Joseph slowly. The Whitaker ranch. Samuel finished the thought. Was never Crow's to take. Joseph swallowed. Was it mine? The question was too large for the small seller. Elias knelt before him and answered carefully. It may belong to a promise made before any of us had courage enough to honor it. Before Joseph could speak, the cellar door burst open. Harsh lantern light flooded the stairs. Silas Crow stood above them with 2 armed men at his back. His eyes dropped immediately to the journal in Elias's hands. That belongs to me. Samuel raised the revolver. Not another step. Crow smiled thinly. You are an old preacher with old bones, Samuel. Old bones aim steadier than young greed. The 2 gunmen shifted uneasily, but Crow did not retreat. His gaze fixed on Joseph next. Boy, come here. Joseph stepped behind Elias. Crow's face hardened. You think that journal makes you something? It does not. It makes you dangerous to people who have built more in this county than your kind ever could. Elias stood, anger rising in him with a force Joseph had never seen. His kind? Crow lifted his chin. A child without proper claim, proper kin, or proper place. Samuel's voice became quiet and deadly. Daniel Reeves gave him place. Crow laughed. Daniel Reeves died. Elias held up the journal. His word did not. For several seconds, the cellar became a powder keg. Then, from somewhere above in the sanctuary, another voice called out, Silas! It was Thomas Whitaker. Crow turned sharply. You fool. Thomas appeared at the top of the stairs with Ruth behind him, both breathless from running. Behind them stood several townsmen holding lanterns, drawn by the noise and the sight of armed riders outside the church. Ruth's eyes went straight to Joseph. Are you hurt? Joseph shook his head, tears suddenly burning his eyes. Thomas looked at Crow with a fury that overcame fear. You told me he had no claim. Crow snapped. He doesn't. Elias lifted the map from the journal. Then why did you break into a church cellar to steal a dead soldier's record? The townsman murmured behind Thomas. Crow realized too late that he had forced the confrontation into the open. Public witness had arrived before he controlled the story. Still, he recovered quickly. These men are trespassing on property matters they do not understand. Samuel took one slow step upward, revolver still steady. Then we shall understand them tomorrow in the cemetery. Crow's jaw tightened. Elias nodded. At Captain Reeves's grave, Ruth descended the stairs and wrapped Joseph in her arms before anyone could stop her. Thomas stood between them and Crow. The boy stays with us. Crow's eyes darkened. Your note comes due in 3 days. Thomas did not move. Then let it come. For the first time that night, Joseph saw fear change sides, not disappear. Change sides. Crow still had money, riders, law papers, and debts in his pocket. But he had lost the shadows. Too many people had seen the broken cellar door, the soldier's journal, the map, and the child's face beside the old photograph. Crow stepped back slowly. Open the grave if you like, he said. You will find bones and regret. Then he looked directly at Joseph. And when this town remembers what you are, no letter will save you. The words were meant to wound, and they did. Yet Ruth held him tighter, and Pastor Elias placed one firm hand on the boy's shoulder. Crow left with his men, boots echoing through the sanctuary until the church doors slammed behind them. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then Samuel Pierce turned to Elias and said softly, He's afraid of what Daniel was buried with. Elias looked down at the map, the letter, the photograph, and the journal resting together in his hands. Then tomorrow we open the grave. Joseph looked toward the stairs where Crow had vanished and felt the world shift again. That morning he had been forced off the ranch because people said he belonged nowhere. Now a dead soldier's journal, a pastor's courage, and his mother's name had begun to say otherwise. Yet as the church emptied and the townsmen carried lanterns into the night, no one noticed Crow's youngest rider slipping away toward the cemetery hill with a shovel tied behind his saddle. Long before sunrise, Pastor Elias Monroe stood alone at the front window of the church, watching pale gray light slowly wash across the empty streets of Red Creek, while Captain Daniel Reeves's journal rested open beside the pulpit exactly where he had left it the night before. Sleep had never come. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Joseph clutching the faded blue blanket, Ayanna's calm face in the old photograph, and Silas Crow's expression the moment the soldier's map appeared inside the cellar. That look had not been anger alone, it had been recognition. Crow already knew the valley described in Reeves's journal. He knew why the Whitaker ranch mattered. More importantly, he knew that if the truth buried beside Captain Reeves reached daylight, everything he had spent years building across the territory might begin to collapse. Elias quietly closed the journal and slipped it into a leather satchel together with the soldier's letter, the tintype photograph, and the hand-drawn map before looking toward the first pew where Joseph still slept beneath the patched blue blanket. The boy looked younger in sleep than he ever did awake, no longer carrying the guarded expression of someone who expected to be unwanted. Pastor Monroe found himself wondering how many nights Joseph had secretly feared being sent away without ever telling the Whitakers. The thought filled him with quiet shame. Adults often believe children failed to understand injustice. The truth was far sadder. Children understood it immediately. They simply lacked the words to describe it. A soft knock echoed through the side entrance just as dawn broke. Samuel Pierce entered first, followed closely by Thomas and Ruth Whitaker, both exhausted from another sleepless night. Ruth crossed the sanctuary almost immediately and knelt beside Joseph, gently brushing loose strands of dark hair away from his forehead. The boy stirred, opened his eyes, and smiled faintly the moment he recognized her. It was the first genuine smile anyone had seen since the eviction began. Ruth embraced him tightly without saying a word. Thomas remained standing near the church door, his weathered face carrying the weight of a man who had spent years believing hard work alone could protect his family, only to discover that greed often ignored honesty. Pastor Monroe motioned for everyone to gather near the altar. He carefully spread Captain Reeves's map across an old wooden table. Samuel studied it again before quietly placing one finger upon a narrow stream crossing the western edge of the Whitaker ranch. "Here," he said. "This is where Daniel first met Ayanna." His finger moved farther north toward a small circle drawn beneath 2 cottonwood trees. "And here," he paused, "this is where they buried the promise." Thomas frowned. "Captain Reeves's grave?" Samuel nodded. "Not the grave itself." He tapped another mark barely visible beneath faded ink. "Something beside it." Elias leaned closer. Until that moment, he had overlooked the tiny drawing completely. 3 stones arranged in a circle. Samuel smiled sadly. Daniel always marked places that way during the war. Joseph looked between the men. What did he hide? Samuel answered honestly. I don't know. Then he added quietly, but Crow believes it's worth stealing. Before anyone could speak again, the church bell suddenly rang once. Only once. Every face lifted immediately. No one had touched the rope. Pastor Monroe hurried toward the entrance and carefully opened the front door. The morning street stood empty except for a small chestnut horse waiting beside the hitching rail. No rider remained. Hanging from the saddle horn rested a canvas sack tied with rough twine. Elias untied it cautiously and carried it inside. Ruth immediately pulled Joseph closer while Thomas quietly reached for the old shotgun standing beside the church wall. Samuel opened the sack carefully upon the table. Inside lay only 2 objects. The first was a child's small leather moccasin, beautifully beaded by hand, worn with age but carefully preserved. Joseph stared at it without understanding. The second object froze everyone in the room. It was a fresh newspaper printed only the day before in Cheyenne. Across the front page appeared a large announcement reporting that Governor Harrison planned to visit Red Creek within the week to celebrate the railroad's newest expansion into the territory. Beneath the headline, someone had written 6 words in thick black ink. The governor must never see Daniel's truth. Pastor Monroe slowly folded the paper. Crow was no longer acting alone. Men powerful enough to influence governors now feared whatever still rested beneath Captain Reeves's grave. Joseph quietly picked up the tiny moccasin. It fit easily inside both his hands. Ruth watched tears slowly fill the boy's eyes. Do you know it? She asked gently. Joseph shook his head. No. Samuel looked closely before answering. Your mother made these. Joseph stared at him. How do you know? The old preacher smiled with quiet certainty. Every family stitched patterns differently. Ayanna used blue thread in the shape of morning stars. He gently turned the moccasin over. There, almost hidden beneath years of wear, appeared the same tiny blue stars embroidered across the leather. Joseph carefully touched them with trembling fingers. For the first time in his life, he held something his mother had once made with her own hands. Not a story. Not a memory belonging to someone else. Something real. Ruth quietly wiped away tears before Joseph noticed them. Pastor Monroe looked toward Thomas. Crow wanted us frightened. Thomas nodded. Instead, he reminded us what's at stake. Later that morning, the small group quietly rode toward the cemetery overlooking Red Creek. Pastor Monroe carried the journal. Samuel carried the map. Thomas brought shovels loaded across his wagon despite secretly praying they would never need to disturb the captain's resting place. Joseph rode beside Ruth in silence, the tiny moccasin tucked carefully inside his coat beside the soldier's photograph. As they climbed the hill, more townspeople gradually joined them. Some came because rumors had spread overnight. Others came because they trusted Pastor Monroe enough to believe something important was happening. Old veterans removed their hats as they approached Captain Reeves's weathered grave. Farmers stood quietly behind them. Even several railroad workers lingered at the edge of the crowd, uncertain where loyalty should now rest. Silas Crow did not appear. That worried Elias more than if the wealthy ranch owner had arrived with 50 armed men. Crow rarely missed opportunities he believed he controlled. If he stayed away, he likely intended something worse. Samuel knelt beside the grave and compared the hand-drawn map with the weathered headstone. Then he slowly stood. The stones. Everyone looked around. 3 small rocks once arranged beside the marker had disappeared. Thomas frowned. They were here yesterday. Elias lowered himself to the ground and examined the disturbed earth. Fresh shovel marks. Someone had worked during the night exactly where Crow's young rider disappeared after leaving the church. Joseph quietly noticed something the adults missed. There. He pointed toward the base of the nearest cottonwood. Half buried beneath loose dirt rested one smooth river stone marked with a faded blue paint stripe. Samuel hurried over and brushed away the soil. Beneath it appeared the edge of an old iron box hidden beneath the roots. Thomas immediately reached for the shovel. His hands shook as he cleared away the remaining earth. Within minutes, the entire box emerged, rusted but intact. Pastor Monroe carefully pried open the lid. Inside rested several oilcloth-wrapped documents untouched by time. On top lay one final sealed envelope addressed simply, "To the family who keeps the promise." Ruth quietly covered her mouth. Thomas looked toward Joseph. Samuel whispered, "Daniel knew someone would come." Before Elias could lift the envelope, hoofbeats thundered across the cemetery road below. Nearly 20 riders appeared, racing hard toward the hill beneath a cloud of dust. At their head rode Silas Crow. This time he did not pretend to be polite. Every man carried a rifle. Crow drew his horse to a stop at the foot of the cemetery and looked directly at the opened iron box. His face lost all color. "You're too late," he shouted. Pastor Monroe slowly lifted the sealed envelope into the morning sunlight. "No, Mr. Crow." His voice carried across the hillside, where the entire town now watched, "I believe." He gently brushed away decades of dust from Captain Reeves's final seal. "You're the one who arrived too late." The morning air over Captain Daniel Reeves's grave turned strangely still as Pastor Elias Monroe lifted the sealed envelope from the rusted iron box, and for a brief moment no one on the cemetery hill seemed willing to breathe. Farmers, veterans, widows, railroad workers, and frightened children all stood frozen beneath the cottonwood trees while Silas Crow and nearly 20 armed riders waited at the bottom of the slope with rifles resting across their saddles. Joseph remained beside Ruth Whitaker, his small hand locked tightly around the faded blue blanket beneath his coat and the tiny beaded moccasin hidden safely inside his pocket. He watched Pastor Monroe brush decades of dust from the envelope with almost reverent care, careful not to damage the dark wax seal impressed with Captain Reeves's initials. Samuel Pierce stepped quietly beside him. "Daniel only used black wax for military oaths," the old preacher whispered. "Whatever is inside was meant to outlive him." Crow heard the remark even from below the hill, and for the first time since anyone had known him, genuine panic flickered across his face. "Don't open it!" he shouted. His voice echoed across the cemetery louder than church bells. The outburst startled everyone, because it revealed what Crow had worked so desperately to hide. Men who possessed nothing to fear rarely begged strangers to leave old letters unopened. Murmurs spread through the gathering crowd. Several railroad workers exchanged uneasy glances. Even a few of Crow's own riders lowered their eyes. Pastor Monroe looked down the hill calmly. "Yesterday you claimed this child meant nothing," he called back. "Today you arrive with 20 armed men to stop a dead soldier's final letter." Crow's answer came immediately. "Because lies grow more dangerous when people want to believe them." Elias nodded slowly. "Then let truth defend itself." He carefully broke the brittle wax seal. Inside rested 3 folded documents tied together with faded blue ribbon. The first was Captain Reeves's signed military affidavit describing Ayana's rescue of the patrol and the solemn promise he made to protect her son before 2 witnesses. The second contained sworn statements signed by Samuel Pierce and Army Surgeon Benjamin Carter, confirming the captain's account only days before Reeves died from his wounds. The third document caused Pastor Monroe's hands to stop moving altogether. It was not military. It bore the Territorial Land Office seal from 22 years earlier, together with the signature of a federal commissioner. Elias unfolded it slowly while Samuel leaned closer. Thomas Whitaker did the same. Ruth held Joseph protectively against her side. The pastor read silently for several seconds before looking toward Crow with quiet disbelief. "This," he whispered, "cannot be why." Samuel gently took the document and read it himself. His weathered face turned pale. "Lord, have mercy." Thomas could no longer contain himself. "What is it?" Samuel slowly handed him the paper. "Read the heading." Thomas swallowed hard before speaking aloud. "Protected Homestead Trust." He stopped, reading farther down the page. "Established by territorial authority for the surviving child of Ayana, to be held in trust until lawful adulthood under the guardianship of Captain Daniel Reeves or his appointed family." Silence swept across the cemetery. Thomas continued reading despite his trembling voice. "The property shall never be transferred through debt collection, foreclosure, or railroad acquisition while the trust remains active." His eyes widened completely. The land described by the legal survey was not merely part of the Whitaker Ranch. It was nearly the entire valley Crow had spent 20 years quietly purchasing piece by piece. Joseph looked from one adult to another without understanding. "Does that mean?" Pastor Monroe knelt beside him. "It means Captain Reeves never abandoned his promise," Samuel finished softly. He protected your home before you were old enough to remember it. Joseph stared toward the distant hills where he had spent his childhood chasing horses and gathering eggs with Thomas. He had always believed the ranch belonged to the Whitakers alone. Now he discovered that every fence post, every pasture, every creek crossing had quietly guarded him all along. Crow suddenly urged his horse several steps forward. "That document is a forgery," he shouted, produced by desperate people trying to steal land through sympathy. Pastor Monroe calmly raised the paper where everyone could see the territorial seal. "Then why did your riders dig beside Captain Reeves's grave during the night?" Crow hesitated for the smallest fraction of a second. It was enough. Eyes throughout the crowd turned toward him with growing suspicion. One elderly rancher stepped forward. "Did you?" Another railroad worker removed his hat and frowned. Crow immediately pointed toward Joseph. "That child has no proof he is the one named in those papers." Samuel quietly reached into the iron box again. "Perhaps Daniel expected you to say that." The old preacher withdrew a small cloth pouch no larger than his hand. Inside rested a silver necklace, carrying a carved turquoise pendant shaped like a rising sun. Joseph stared at it without knowing why his chest suddenly tightened. Samuel carefully opened the pendant. Hidden inside rested a tiny lock of black hair and one folded scrap of paper. Pastor Monroe unfolded it gently. Captain Reeves had written only one sentence. "When the boy wears this around his neck, no honest man will question whose son he is." Ruth's eyes filled with tears as she fastened the necklace around Joseph's neck. The pendant rested naturally against the faded blue blanket hidden beneath his shirt, as though both had always belonged together. Crow understood something terrible then. Every document he believed buried forever had survived. Every promise he expected time to erase had endured. Every witness he assumed dead now stood openly against him. His expression hardened into desperation. He raised one hand sharply. Instantly, several of his riders lifted their rifles. Gasps spread across the cemetery. Women pulled children behind gravestones. Thomas Whitaker stepped directly in front of Joseph without hesitation. Samuel quietly drew his old cavalry revolver. Pastor Monroe remained standing exactly where he was, still holding Captain Reeves's papers in plain sight. "Silas," he said calmly, "don't make this your last mistake." Crow ignored him. "Take the documents!" he shouted. 3 riders urged their horses up the hill. Before they reached halfway, another voice thundered across the cemetery. "That's enough!" Everyone turned toward the road leading from town. Nearly 40 mounted citizens were riding toward the hill. Farmers, blacksmiths, shopkeepers, several Civil War veterans wearing faded blue coats. Even railroad laborers had abandoned their work crews to join them. At their front rode Judge Harold Bennett, the oldest circuit judge in the county, carrying no rifle, only a leather case containing official court seals. Crow stared in disbelief. "Judge Bennett?" The elderly judge stopped his horse beside Pastor Monroe and surveyed the scene without hurry. "Mr. Crow," he said quietly, "it appears you've gathered quite an army for a cemetery." Crow forced a smile. "I came to prevent fraud." Bennett extended his hand toward Pastor Monroe. "May I see the documents?" Elias placed the affidavit, the trust papers, and the soldier's oath into the judge's waiting hands. Bennett examined each seal carefully. His expression never changed. After several long minutes, he looked directly at Crow. "These are genuine." A wave of whispers swept through the crowd. Crow's face lost every trace of confidence. "Impossible." Judge Bennett folded the papers carefully. "Not impossible. Inconvenient." He looked toward Joseph. "Until this matter is heard formally, the Protected Homestead Trust remains legally active." Then he turned back toward Crow. "Which means every acre acquired inside its boundaries may now be subject to judicial review." Several of Crow's own riders quietly lowered their rifles. One removed his bandana and looked away entirely. They had signed on to guard cattle, enforce debts, and intimidate poor families. They had not agreed to stand against lawful court papers and a dead soldier's final oath. Crow realized he was losing control by the minute. His eyes swept desperately across the crowd until they settled on Joseph. Hatred replaced calculation. Everything would have stayed buried if that boy had simply left the ranch. Joseph met his gaze for the first time without lowering his eyes. He still felt afraid. The fear had not disappeared. But standing beside Ruth, Thomas, Pastor Monroe, Samuel, Judge Bennett, and dozens of ordinary townspeople, he no longer felt alone. Crow slowly backed his horse away. "This isn't finished," he said quietly. Judge Bennett answered before anyone else could. "No." He closed the leather case containing the documents with a firm snap. "It has only just begun." Crow turned sharply and galloped down the cemetery road with several loyal riders following behind, but many others remained where they stood, unwilling to ride after him again. Pastor Monroe watched until the last cloud of dust disappeared beyond the ridge. Then Samuel looked toward the judge. "He'll strike before the hearing." Bennett nodded gravely. "Men like Crow always do." Thomas frowned. "Then what do we do?" The judge looked toward Joseph, whose small hand rested unconsciously upon the turquoise pendant hanging around his neck. "We protect the boy," Bennett answered. "Because after today, he isn't merely a frightened child anymore." He paused before adding the words that sent another chill through everyone gathered beneath the cottonwoods. "He is now the only living key to everything Silas Crow has spent 20 years trying to bury." The crowd remained on the cemetery hill long after Silas Crow disappeared beyond the ridge, unwilling to leave, while Captain Daniel Reeves's documents rested in Pastor Elias Monroe's hands. The morning sun had climbed high enough to cast long shadows from the old cottonwoods across the graves, yet no one seemed aware of the passing hours. Farmers who had once hurried home before noon now stood shoulder to shoulder with Civil War veterans, widows, shopkeepers, railroad laborers, and families who had spent years believing the history of Red Creek began only when wealthy ranchers arrived with money and deeds. Joseph stood quietly beside Ruth Whitaker, with the turquoise pendant resting against his chest beneath the faded blue blanket. He watched the adults whisper among themselves, their eyes no longer fixed on him with suspicion but with something entirely different: curiosity, compassion, regret. For the first time since he could remember, strangers looked at him as though they wanted to know his story instead of erase it. Pastor Monroe carefully returned Captain Reeves's affidavit, the trust papers, the map, and the soldier's letter to the leather satchel before lifting the final item from the iron box. It was a narrow leather portfolio, weathered by time but sealed with another faded strip of blue ribbon. Samuel Pierce immediately recognized it. Daniel carried that beside his heart throughout the war. Elias slowly untied the ribbon. Inside rested dozens of folded pages written in different hands. Some belonged to Captain Reeves. Others bore signatures Joseph had never seen. At the very bottom lay one envelope addressed only to the child when he is ready to hear the truth. Joseph looked toward the pastor. "Is that for me?" Elias nodded gently. "I believe it always was." Before anyone could open the envelope, Judge Harold Bennett quietly raised one hand. "Not here." Every face turned toward him. The elderly judge looked across the gathering crowd before continuing. "Whatever Daniel Reeves entrusted to this boy deserves witnesses worthy of the promise." Pastor Monroe understood immediately. "The church." Bennett nodded. "Every honest citizen who wishes to hear may come." Samuel smiled faintly. Exactly as Daniel hoped. Word spread quickly through Red Creek. Church bells rang not for worship alone, but to summon every person willing to hear the truth buried for more than 2 decades. By the time Pastor Monroe carried the leather portfolio into the sanctuary, every pew had filled. Families stood along the walls. Veterans removed their hats. Mothers held restless children quietly against their shoulders. Railroad workers slipped into the back rows, uncertain whether they would still have jobs by sunset. Even men who had openly supported Crow now came because curiosity had become stronger than loyalty. Joseph entered beside Ruth and Thomas Whitaker, unsure whether he belonged near the front or hidden somewhere in the back. Pastor Monroe solved the question without speaking. He led the boy to the first pew directly beneath the pulpit. "Today," he whispered, "you listen as the son Captain Reeves promised to protect." Silence settled across the sanctuary as Elias carefully broke the final envelope's seal. The paper inside had yellowed with age, but remained perfectly preserved. The pastor unfolded it and began reading aloud. Captain Daniel Reeves wrote that if Joseph ever heard those words, it meant both he and Ayanna were gone and the burden of the promise now belonged to others. He described the winter campaign during which his patrol became stranded beyond the northern ridge after corrupt contractors deliberately abandoned military wagons to claim additional government supplies. Reeves admitted that several influential businessmen had secretly profited from prolonging conflict across the territory because unsettled land could later be purchased cheaply from desperate families. Among the names Daniel listed appeared Silas Crow's father, Nathaniel Crow. A murmur swept through the sanctuary. Judge Bennett quietly closed his eyes. Samuel lowered his head. Reeves continued by describing how Ayanna repeatedly warned innocent settlers and soldiers alike whenever hired raiders planned attacks designed to frighten families away from valuable grazing valleys. She refused to choose sides in a war driven by greed instead of honor. Instead, she chose people. Captain Reeves wrote that many white children survived because Ayanna guided them through blizzards after their wagon train became lost. Several elderly women in the congregation suddenly began crying. One slowly stood. "I remember that winter," she whispered. "My brother lived because someone carried him through the snow." Another old man rose beside her. "My mother spoke of a native woman with blue stars sewn onto her moccasins." Joseph instinctively reached into his pocket and touched the tiny beaded moccasins Samuel had given him that morning. The blue stars. Pastor Monroe turned another page. Captain Reeves explained that shortly before his death he discovered Nathaniel Crow and several railroad investors intended to seize the valley where Ayanna's people had sheltered refugees by claiming no lawful heirs remained. To stop them, Reeves convinced a territorial commissioner to create the Protected Homestead Trust in Joseph's name until adulthood. The Whitakers had not been chosen by chance. Thomas Whitaker's father had once served under Reeves during the war and was the only man Daniel believed would honor the promise without seeking reward. Thomas looked toward the floor as tears slowly rolled down his weathered face. Ruth gently took his hand. Neither had known why Thomas's late father insisted they never sell the western pasture regardless of debt or hardship. Now they finally understood. It had never truly been theirs to sell. Joseph quietly looked toward Thomas. "Your father knew?" Thomas nodded slowly. "Not everything." His voice broke. "Only enough to tell me that one day a child would need us more than the land ever would." Joseph lowered his eyes, unable to speak. Then Pastor Monroe reached the final pages. His expression changed. Samuel noticed immediately. "What is it?" Elias hesitated only briefly before continuing. Captain Reeves described one final meeting with Ayanna shortly before she died. She had not asked him to avenge her. She had not asked him to punish those responsible. She asked only that Joseph never grow ashamed of who he was. Reeves wrote that Ayanna feared the world would someday convince her son he belonged nowhere because he carried two histories that frightened powerful men. The captain ended with one sentence written larger than all the others. "Tell Joseph that blood does not decide a family. Promises do." The church became utterly silent. Joseph stared at the floor while those words settled into his heart. Every painful memory returned at once. Every insult. Every lonely night wondering why he looked different from the Whitakers. Every whispered remark that he did not belong. Yet beside him sat Ruth, holding his hand, exactly as she always had. Thomas placed his rough-weathered hand gently upon the boy's shoulder. Pastor Monroe looked down from the pulpit with tears in his own eyes. Samuel Pierce removed his old cavalry hat. Joseph slowly understood what Captain Reeves had wanted him to know. He had never been abandoned. The promise had simply traveled farther than the people who carried it. A sudden sound shattered the silence. The church doors burst open. A frightened ranch hand stumbled inside, bleeding from a cut above his forehead. "Pastor!" he gasped. "Judge!" Everyone turned. The young man struggled to catch his breath. Crow's riders. He swallowed hard. "They've burned the Whitaker barn." Gasps echoed through the sanctuary. Ruth immediately stood. Thomas's face turned white. The ranch hand continued desperately. The cattle were driven off, fences destroyed, and he looked directly at Joseph. They left a message. Pastor Monroe stepped down from the pulpit. "What message?" The young man answered in a trembling voice. "They said if the boy stays in Red Creek until the funeral tomorrow." He stopped, unable to finish. Judge Bennett spoke quietly. "Say it." The ranch hand lowered his eyes. "They said Captain Reeves won't be the only grave opened this week." The sanctuary fell into stunned silence. Pastor Monroe slowly closed Captain Reeves's letter. Samuel's hand tightened around his old revolver. Thomas moved protectively in front of Ruth and Joseph without thinking. Judge Bennett looked toward the congregation and understood immediately what Crow intended. The funeral for Captain Reeves, scheduled for the following afternoon to honor the soldier publicly after the discovery of the documents, would become the place where Crow planned to end the promise forever. Pastor Monroe rested one steady hand upon Joseph's shoulder. Then, he said quietly, though every person in the church heard him clearly, "We'll all attend the funeral together." Outside, far beyond the church windows, a column of dark smoke rose slowly into the afternoon sky from the direction of the Whitaker ranch, and Joseph realized the war Captain Reeves believed had ended 22 years earlier had never truly ended at all. It had only been waiting for him to grow old enough to inherit it. The column of black smoke rising above the Whitaker ranch remained visible throughout the afternoon, hanging over Red Creek like a warning no one could ignore. And although frightened whispers spread through every street, not a single family left town. Instead, people quietly prepared for Captain Daniel Reeves's funeral, understanding that the ceremony had become something far greater than the burial of a forgotten soldier. It would decide whether fear or truth governed Red Creek from that day forward. Pastor Elias Monroe spent the remaining hours inside the church, arranging the simple pine coffin brought from the old cemetery chapel, while Samuel Pierce carefully cleaned Captain Reeves's weathered cavalry hat and folded union, en flag. Judge Harold Bennett remained in his office, drafting emergency orders protecting the protected homestead trust until a formal hearing could be held, but he privately admitted to Pastor Monroe that court papers alone would not stop a desperate man like Silas Crow. Thomas Whitaker and several neighboring ranchers worked through the night trying to save what remained of the burned barn and scattered cattle, while Ruth refused to leave Joseph's side even for a moment. The boy sat quietly on the church steps, watching lanterns appear one by one across the town, his fingers resting upon the turquoise pendant beneath his shirt. Every few minutes he reached into his pocket to touch the tiny beaded moccasin his mother had once sewn with blue stars. It had become the closest thing he possessed to a memory of her. Pastor Monroe eventually joined him beneath the fading evening sky. Neither spoke immediately. The old minister simply looked toward the smoke still drifting above the distant hills. "Do you think Mr. Crow hates me?" Joseph finally asked. Elias turned toward him with sadness in his eyes. "No, son," Joseph frowned. "Then why does he keep trying to take everything away?" The pastor took several moments before answering. "Because some people become so frightened of losing power that they stop seeing human beings. They only see obstacles." Joseph lowered his head. "Am I an obstacle?" Elias gently placed one hand upon the boy's shoulder. "No." His voice remained calm and certain. "You're a promise that survived." The next morning dawned cold and gray. Low clouds covered the prairie, while a slow autumn wind moved through the cottonwood branches surrounding the cemetery. Nearly the entire town gathered long before the funeral began. Farmers arrived in wagons. Families walked together carrying wildflowers. Elderly Civil War veterans stood in faded blue uniforms, carefully brushed clean for the occasion. Even railroad workers appeared, despite knowing Crow would likely dismiss any man seen honoring Captain Reeves. Joseph walked beside Ruth and Thomas Whitaker, behind the simple wagon carrying the soldier's coffin. Pastor Monroe led the procession with Samuel Pierce at his side. Judge Bennett followed immediately behind, holding the leather case containing Captain Reeves's affidavit, the soldier's journal, the protected homestead trust, and every document recovered from the iron box beneath the cottonwoods. As they climbed the cemetery hill, Joseph noticed something strange. Fresh flowers had already been placed beside Captain Reeves's grave before sunrise. No one knew who brought them. Samuel quietly smiled when he saw them. "Daniel still has friends," he whispered. The funeral began simply. Pastor Monroe spoke first. Not about war or medals, but about quiet courage. He told the gathering how Captain Reeves chose to keep a promise to a dying mother, even when doing so cost him friendships, reputation, and eventually his own life. Samuel Pierce then stepped forward carrying the old cavalry hat. His voice trembled as he described Daniel Reeves not as a hero carved from legend, but as an ordinary man who made one extraordinary decision. He discovered, Samuel said softly, that honor is measured not by the enemies a soldier defeats, but by the promises he refuses to abandon. Silence settled across the cemetery. Several veterans quietly removed their hats. Ruth held Joseph's hand tighter. Thomas lowered his eyes. Then Pastor Monroe invited Joseph to step forward. The boy hesitated. Hundreds of eyes followed him as he approached Captain Reeves's grave, carrying only the small beaded moccasin and the faded blue blanket. Joseph knelt beside the headstone and gently placed the tiny moccasin upon the fresh earth. "Thank you," he whispered. The words were barely audible, yet nearly everyone heard them because no one else dared breathe. At that exact moment, a voice interrupted the silence. "I object." Heads turned instantly. Silas Crow rode slowly through the cemetery gate accompanied by Sheriff Caleb Morris and nearly a dozen armed riders. Unlike previous confrontations, Crow wore neither anger nor panic. Instead, he carried the calm confidence of a man who believed he had finally found the weapon needed to destroy everything Captain Reeves had protected. Several of the townspeople instinctively stepped backward. Others moved closer together. Pastor Monroe remained beside the grave without moving. Judge Bennett calmly closed his leather case. Crow dismounted, removed one folded document from inside his coat, and held it toward the crowd. "Before you bury this man as a hero," he announced loudly, "perhaps everyone deserves to know who Captain Reeves truly was." Samuel frowned immediately. "What are you talking about?" Crow smiled faintly. "Military disciplinary records." A ripple of surprise passed through the crowd. Crow unfolded the paper dramatically. Captain Daniel Reeves was investigated during the war for disobeying direct orders, abandoning his assigned route, and concealing unauthorized civilians during military operations. Murmurs spread through the cemetery. Crow continued. His commanding officer recommended court-martial proceedings shortly before his death. He looked directly toward Joseph. "This is the man you now trust." Several townspeople exchanged uncertain glances. Even Thomas Whitaker seemed shaken. Crow sensed hesitation and pressed harder. "The entire story you've heard rests upon the testimony of a disgraced officer." Pastor Monroe accepted the document without argument and quietly read it. Samuel leaned beside him. After several long moments, both men looked at each other. Then Samuel unexpectedly laughed. Not loudly, softly, almost sadly. Crow frowned. "Something amusing?" Samuel nodded. "Yes." He looked toward Judge Bennett. "May I?" The judge gestured for him to continue. Samuel turned back toward the gathering crowd and held up Crow's paper. "Everything written here is true." Gasps escaped several people. Crow smiled triumphantly. Then Samuel continued. "Captain Reeves was investigated because he refused an order." He paused. The order was to leave wounded settlers, orphaned children, and Ayanna's village behind, so the army could protect a supply train carrying railroad survey maps. Silence returned instantly. Samuel's eyes moved slowly across the crowd. Daniel disobeyed. He looked toward Joseph. Instead, he chose people over profit. Pastor Monroe reached into the leather portfolio and removed another folded letter. Captain Reeves explained the investigation himself. He began reading aloud. Daniel admitted violating orders because those orders abandoned innocent families to hired raiders secretly financed by land speculators. He wrote that no military commission could convince him saving children was dishonorable. Every sentence transformed Crow's attempted attack into unexpected proof of Captain Reeves's character. Judge Bennett quietly addressed the crowd. "History often punishes the right man before finally honoring him." Several Civil War veterans nodded solemnly. Crow realized too late that his evidence had failed. His face hardened once again. "Fine." He looked toward Joseph. "Then let the boy answer one question." Everyone grew still. Crow stepped closer to the child. "Who is your family?" Joseph looked uncertain for only a moment. Then he slowly turned, first toward Ruth Whitaker, then Thomas, then Pastor Monroe, Samuel Pierce, Judge Bennett. Finally, he looked across the hundreds of faces gathered throughout the cemetery. Men who once ignored him now stood quietly waiting. Women smiled through tears. Old veterans removed their hats completely. Joseph understood something Captain Reeves had known long before he was born. Family was not created by fear. It was chosen through promise. The boy looked back at Crow. His voice remained soft, but every person on the cemetery hill heard him clearly. All of them. No one spoke. Then, from somewhere near the back of the crowd, an elderly woman began applauding. Another joined her. Then another. Within seconds, the entire cemetery echoed with applause unlike anything Red Creek had ever witnessed. Crow stood completely alone in the middle of it. The people had answered before any court ever could. Joseph no longer belonged to no one. He belonged to all who chose to keep the promise. As the applause slowly faded, Pastor Monroe prepared to lower Captain Reeves's coffin into the grave. 4 veterans stepped forward to serve as pallbearers. Samuel gently placed the old cavalry hat upon the lid one final time. Then, just as the ropes began lowering the coffin, a dull metallic sound echoed from inside the grave itself. Everyone froze. The coffin had struck something beneath the freshly opened earth. Samuel frowned immediately. "Stop!" The veterans halted. Judge Bennett stepped closer. Pastor Monroe knelt beside the grave and carefully brushed away loose soil near one corner. There, hidden beneath decades of packed earth, appeared the edge of a second iron chest far larger than the one discovered beneath the cottonwoods. Samuel's face drained of color. "Dear Lord," he whispered. Pastor Monroe looked toward him. "You knew?" Samuel slowly shook his head. "No." His voice barely escaped above a whisper. "But Daniel once told me." He stopped. "If I fail to return," he looked directly at Joseph, "the last promise will sleep beneath me." Every eye turned toward the newly discovered chest. Whatever Captain Daniel Reeves had buried beneath his own grave had remained hidden for 22 years, waiting for the exact moment Joseph finally stood surrounded by the family. His mother prayed he would one day find. The entire cemetery stood in stunned silence as Pastor Elias Monroe brushed away the last layer of earth covering the large iron chest hidden beneath Captain Daniel Reeves's grave. No one moved. The funeral had stopped midway through the lowering of the soldier's coffin, and the rope still hung motionless above the open grave, while nearly every citizen of Red Creek stared toward the rusted lid emerging from beneath the packed soil. Joseph remained beside Ruth Whitaker with one hand wrapped tightly around the turquoise pendant beneath his shirt and the other gripping her fingers so firmly that neither of them noticed. Samuel Pierce slowly removed his hat. Tears gathered quietly in his weathered eyes. "Daniel," he whispered, almost smiling through his grief. "You stubborn old friend." Judge Harold Bennett knelt beside Pastor Monroe, carefully inspecting the chest without touching it. Unlike the smaller box discovered beneath the cottonwoods, this one bore 2 seals instead of 1. The first carried Captain Reeves's initials. The second displayed the faded emblem of the United States Army. Bennett looked toward Samuel in surprise. "Military property?" Samuel shook his head slowly. "Military protection." The distinction mattered. Before anyone could ask another question, the sound of galloping horses echoed once more across the valley. Silas Crow had returned. This time he was not accompanied by ranch hands or hired cowboys. He rode beside 3 territorial officials dressed in dark government coats, followed by armed deputies carrying official warrants. Behind them came nearly 30 riders loyal to the railroad syndicate. Crow stopped his horse only yards from the grave and pointed directly toward the chest. By authority of the Territorial Land Commission, he announced loudly, "That container is now government evidence." Several townspeople immediately stepped backward. The arrival of government officials created uncertainty where moments earlier there had been unity. One of the commissioners unfolded an official document and approached Judge Bennett. "We have orders to confiscate every item connected to disputed federal property claims." Bennett accepted the warrant without speaking. He read it carefully from beginning to end. Then he quietly folded the paper and returned it. "This warrant was signed yesterday." The commissioner nodded. "Correct." Bennett looked directly into his eyes. "Then it was issued before anyone knew this chest existed." The commissioner hesitated. Crow immediately interrupted. "The chest is irrelevant." Bennett calmly turned toward him. "No, Mr. Crow." His voice carried across the cemetery. "Your timing is." Pastor Monroe slowly placed one hand upon the iron lid. "Captain Reeves buried this with his own body." Crow answered sharply. "Exactly why it belongs in official custody." Samuel stepped forward. "Official custody?" His tired eyes settled upon the 3 commissioners. "Tell these people who requested the warrant." None of the officials answered immediately. Samuel looked toward the oldest among them. "Say his name." The commissioner lowered his eyes. "Nathaniel Crow." Gasps spread across the cemetery. Joseph looked toward Ruth in confusion. Pastor Monroe quietly addressed the gathering crowd. Nathaniel Crow died 15 years ago. Samuel nodded sadly, but not before requesting that every military record connected to Captain Reeves be seized if ever discovered. Judge Bennett frowned. He planned for this. Samuel answered softly. He feared it. Crow suddenly raised his voice. Enough stories. He pointed toward the commissioners. Open the chest. None of them moved. Too many witnesses now surrounded the grave. Too many eyes watched every decision. Finally, Judge Bennett spoke. The funeral has not ended. Crow laughed once. You think a funeral outweighs government authority? Bennett answered quietly. Today. He looked toward the coffin, still suspended above the grave. It might. The elderly judge removed his own black coat, folded it neatly across one arm, and climbed down into the open grave beside the chest. Every person present watched in complete silence. Bennett carefully examined the rusted hinges before noticing another inscription hidden beneath layers of dirt. He brushed the metal clean with his sleeve. Samuel leaned forward immediately. What does it say? Bennett read aloud. To be opened only after my burial, in the presence of the child. He looked up toward Joseph. Daniel named one witness. Crow's face hardened. That changes nothing. The judge ignored him. Joseph. The boy hesitated only briefly before Ruth gently nodded. Together they approached the grave. Bennett extended one hand toward him. Would you help me? Joseph climbed carefully down beside the old judge. For the first time in his life, he stood inside the grave of the man who had sacrificed everything to keep a promise made before Joseph was old enough to remember his own mother's face. Bennett placed the small iron key recovered from the first chest into Joseph's palm. I believe this belongs to you. The key fit perfectly into the second lock. Joseph looked toward Pastor Monroe. Elias smiled gently. Whenever you're ready. The boy slowly turned the key. The lock clicked. Nothing else. No explosion. No hidden mechanism. Only the quiet sound of old metal surrendering to truth after 22 years. Together, Judge Bennett and Joseph lifted the heavy lid. Inside rested no gold, no weapons, no treasure. Instead, they found bundles of letters, military payroll books, survey maps, sworn depositions, and dozens of leather-bound ledgers carefully wrapped in oilcloth. At the very top lay one final envelope addressed simply, to whoever tries to bury the truth again. Samuel immediately recognized Daniel's handwriting. Pastor Monroe accepted the envelope carefully before opening it. Crow watched every movement with growing desperation. Inside rested only a single handwritten page. Elias began reading aloud. Captain Reeves wrote that if anyone attempted to confiscate the chest after his death, that act alone would reveal the guilty men because honest people had nothing to fear from written truth. He explained that every ledger inside documented illegal land seizures, fraudulent military supply contracts, false casualty reports, and payments made to hired raiders who forced native families, widows, homesteaders, and small ranchers from valuable valleys before railroad expansion. Every payment bore signatures. Every survey carried official seals. Every ledger connected names, dates, locations, and bank records. Daniel ended the letter with one final sentence. The man who demands this chest belongs to him has already confessed more loudly than any witness ever could. No one looked toward the chest anymore. Every eye turned toward Silas Crow. For several seconds he remained perfectly still. Then something inside him finally broke. "Take it," he shouted. His riders hesitated. "Take all of it." Still no one moved. The commissioners looked at one another uncertainly. Several deputies quietly stepped away from Crow's horse. One railroad foreman removed his hat and backed into the crowd. Fear, once Crow's greatest weapon, had changed sides completely. Crow's face twisted with rage. "You fools!" he screamed. "Everything you own came because men like my father had the courage to build this territory." An elderly Civil War veteran standing near the front quietly answered, "No." The crowd parted as the old soldier stepped forward carrying a weathered cane. "We built it." Another veteran joined him. Then another. Farmers followed, widows, railroad workers, blacksmiths, storekeepers. One by one, they formed a silent line between Crow and Captain Reeves's grave. No rifles, no threats. Only ordinary people refusing to move. Crow looked around desperately. The line kept growing. Even two of his own deputies quietly crossed over to stand. Judge Bennett slowly climbed out of the grave, carrying one of the military ledgers beneath his arm. He opened it before everyone present. Inside appeared hundreds of payment records bearing Nathaniel Crow's signature. Beside many entries were notes identifying burned settlements, forced removals, murdered scouts, stolen cattle, and displaced native families. One page carried Silas Crow's own signature from years later, authorizing continued payments to the same network. Judge Bennett closed the ledger. There is no dispute anymore. The oldest territorial commissioner finally removed the official commission badge from his coat. He looked directly at Silas Crow. "Sir." His voice trembled slightly. "You're under arrest." Crow laughed. Not because anything amused him, because everything had finally ended. Without warning, he wheeled his horse sharply, attempting to break through the line of citizens and escape down the western trail. Before he managed 3 strides, dozens of ranchers moved together. Not violently, simply together. The frightened horse stopped. Crow looked around. Every road had quietly closed. No guns pointed at him. No ropes waited. Only faces. Faces of people he had spent years intimidating. People who no longer feared him. Sheriff Caleb Morris slowly rode forward. He looked at Crow for several long seconds before removing the handcuffs from his saddle. "I should have stopped this years ago." Crow stared at him with disbelief. "You worked for me." Caleb lowered his eyes. "I worked for fear." Then he fastened the irons around Silas Crow's wrists. No one cheered. No one celebrated. The silence itself carried greater weight than triumph. As deputies led Crow away beneath armed guard, Pastor Monroe looked toward Captain Reeves's open grave. The funeral still waited. The promise still waited. The truth had finally won. Only one farewell remained before the story could truly end. No one moved for a long while after Silas Crow was taken down the cemetery road in irons, because the silence he left behind felt larger than any shout of victory could have been. The people of Red Creek remained gathered around Captain Daniel Reeves's open grave, looking from the rusted iron chest to the soldier's coffin, from Pastor Elias Monroe to Judge Harold Bennett, and finally toward Joseph, the child who had been forced from the Whitaker ranch only days earlier and now stood at the center of a promise that had outlived war, greed, death, and fear. Pastor Monroe gently closed the last military ledger and placed it back inside the chest, not to hide it again, but to protect it until proper copies could be made and carried to every court, every land office, and every family harmed by the Crow Syndicate. Judge Bennett stood beside him with the expression of a man who knew the work ahead would be long, difficult, and full of men trying to save their reputations before saving the truth. Yet the first victory had already happened. Ordinary people had seen the evidence with their own eyes. Veterans had heard Captain Reeves's words. Families had watched Crow try to seize the chest before it could be opened. No judge, no railroad official, and no wealthy rancher could make the entire cemetery forget what it had witnessed. Samuel Pierce finally stepped toward the coffin and placed Captain Reeves's weathered cavalry hat upon the lid. His old hands trembled as he did it. "Rest now, Daniel," he whispered. "The boy knows." Pastor Monroe nodded to the pallbearers, and slowly, with reverence deeper than before, the coffin was lowered into the grave above the place where the final promise had slept for 22 years. This time no hidden metal interrupted the descent. This time nothing remained buried that needed to speak. Joseph stood beside Ruth and Thomas Whitaker, holding the tiny beaded moccasin in one hand and the turquoise pendant in the other. When Pastor Monroe asked whether anyone wished to speak before the earth was returned, the boy surprised everyone by stepping forward. His voice was small at first, but steady enough to carry through the cemetery. "I don't remember Captain Reeves," he said, looking down at the coffin. "And I don't remember my mother." He swallowed hard. "But I know they remembered me." Ruth covered her mouth as tears filled her eyes. Thomas looked toward the sky. Joseph continued, "I thought being alone meant nobody wanted me, but maybe some people were loving me before I was old enough to know it." No one in the cemetery spoke. Even the wind seemed to pause among the cottonwoods. Joseph gently placed the blue-starred moccasin upon the coffin before the first soil fell. "Tell my mother I know her name now," he whispered. Then he stepped back into Ruth's arms and the people of Red Creek wept without shame. The weeks that followed changed the county more slowly than the funeral had changed the town, but just as surely, Judge Bennett filed emergency injunctions protecting the entire valley from foreclosure, sale, seizure, or railroad transfer until the Protected Homestead Trust could be formally reviewed by territorial and federal authorities. Copies of Captain Reeves's ledgers traveled by armed courier to Cheyenne, Denver, and Washington. The governor's celebratory railroad visit was postponed, then quietly transformed into an official inquiry after witnesses from 3 counties came forward with stories that matched Daniel's records. Men who once boasted of owning half the territory suddenly discovered that ownership built upon fraud had fragile roots. Several officials resigned before warrants could reach them. Others tried to blame dead men, missing clerks, or faulty maps, but Daniel Reeves had kept records too carefully for lies to breathe long beside them. Silas Crow faced trial not only for fraud and intimidation, but for ordering the burning of the Whitaker barn and attempting to suppress federal trust documents. Some expected him to remain defiant until the end. Instead, witnesses said he sat through the first hearing staring at the table as though still unable to understand how a child, a pastor, and a dead soldier's letter had undone everything his father built. Sheriff Caleb Morris publicly confessed his own cowardice and surrendered every communication he had carried for Crow. The town did not forgive him quickly. Perhaps it never fully would, but his confession helped restore cattle, land, and money to families who had long believed nothing could be recovered. Justice in the West rarely arrived clean. It came with dust, argument, and paperwork stained by old guilt. But this time, it came. The Whitaker Ranch survived the winter because the town refused to let it fail. Men who had stood silent during Joseph's eviction arrived with lumber before the first snow. Women brought blankets, flour, beans, and coffee. Railroad workers who had abandoned Crow's orders helped rebuild the barn with their own hands. Veterans repaired fences. Children gathered scattered nails from the ashes. Pastor Monroe organized meals from the church kitchen until Ruth threatened to lock the pantry if he kept giving away more food than she could replace. For the first time, Joseph saw Red Creek not as a town that hated him, but as a town ashamed of how slowly it had learned to love him. That did not erase everything. Some people still looked away when he passed. Some old words still followed him from narrow mouths behind closed shutters. Healing did not mean all cruelty vanished. It meant cruelty no longer ruled the street unchallenged. Whenever Joseph walked into town wearing the turquoise pendant, someone greeted him by name. Not boy, not stray, not Indian child, Joseph. Spring came gently that year. Grass returned first along the creek, then across the lower pasture, then in bright green patches where fire had blackened the barnyard. On the first warm Sunday after the snow melted, Pastor Monroe held a special gathering beneath the cottonwoods at the edge of the Whitaker Ranch. Judge Bennett read aloud the final ruling confirming the Protected Homestead Trust and recognizing Joseph as its rightful beneficiary until adulthood, with Thomas and Ruth Whitaker appointed lawful guardians according to Captain Reeves's request and the consent of the court. The valley would remain protected land, not to be sold to railroad men, creditors, or speculators, but held for the boy and any kin of Ayanna's people who returned in peace to visit, remember, or remain. When the judge finished, he handed the papers not to Thomas, not to Ruth, not to Pastor Monroe, but to Joseph. The boy accepted them with both hands. "Does this mean I own the ranch?" he asked softly. Thomas knelt in front of him, smiling through tears. "It means the ranch has been keeping you safe all along." Ruth placed one hand over Joseph's. "And it means we are your family by law now, not only by love." Joseph looked down at the court papers, then at the blue blanket folded over Ruth's arm, then at the hills where his mother's name seemed to move with the wind. He did not know how to hold that much happiness without being afraid it might vanish. Pastor Monroe seemed to understand. "Joy can feel frightening when sorrow has been your teacher," he told him gently, "but you may still receive it." Months later, a small memorial was built near the pasture stream where Captain Reeves first met Ayanna during the blizzard. It was simple. 3 stones placed in a circle, a carved wooden cross for the soldier, and beside it a smooth river stone marked with blue stars for Joseph's mother. No one called it a monument. It was too humble for that. But travelers sometimes stopped there after hearing the story in nearby towns, and many left wildflowers, prayer ribbons, or small carved tokens out of respect. Samuel Pierce visited often, sitting beneath the cottonwoods and telling Joseph everything he remembered about Reeves and Ayanna. He spoke not only of suffering, but of laughter, stubbornness, courage, songs by winter fires, and the way Ayanna once scolded 3 soldiers for wasting coffee grounds when men were freezing. Joseph collected those stories carefully, like a child gathering kindling before a long, cold night. Each one warmed a place inside him that had once felt empty. One evening near harvest, Joseph walked with Pastor Monroe along the ridge overlooking the ranch. Below them, the rebuilt barn stood strong and red against the sunset. Thomas worked near the corral. Ruth waved from the porch. Smoke rose from the kitchen chimney. Farther out, several families had pitched temporary lodges near the creek after arriving from the north. Relatives of Ayanna's people who had heard the trust now welcomed them without fear. Joseph had been nervous before meeting them, afraid he would not know how to belong among people whose language he barely understood. But an elderly woman with silver braids had taken his face gently between her hands and wept when she saw the blue-starred moccasin. She had known Ayanna as a girl. She called Joseph by the name Little Dawn, then by Joseph, and told him both names could live inside one heart. The memory still made him quiet. Pastor Monroe watched him thoughtfully. "What troubles you?" Joseph looked toward the fading light. "I used to think I had to choose." "Choose what?" "Who I was." The pastor waited. Joseph touched the turquoise pendant. But maybe Captain Reeves was right. Maybe promises make room. Elias smiled softly. "They do, when honest people keep them." Joseph looked down at the ranch and finally understood. He was Ayanna's son. He was the child Captain Reeves protected. He was Ruth and Thomas Whitaker's boy. He was Joseph. He was Little Dawn. He belonged to grief, yes, but also to land, memory, courage, and love. That winter, Red Creek changed the sign at the road leading to the valley. It no longer bore Crow's brand or railroad survey marks. A new wooden arch stood there instead, carved by Thomas and painted by the schoolchildren in town. It read Reeves Promise Valley. Beneath the words, Joseph had carefully painted 3 blue stars. On the day the sign was raised, Pastor Monroe led a prayer. Samuel Pierce placed one hand over his heart, and Ruth held Joseph close, while Thomas pretended dust had blown into his eyes. The town that once watched a child forced from a ranch now gathered to welcome him home. The wound of what had happened would always remain part of the valley's story, but it would no longer be the final chapter. The final chapter belonged to a promise kept. It belonged to a mother whose courage outlived her death, a soldier whose letter crossed 22 years, a pastor who chose truth over comfort, a family who loved beyond law, and a child who discovered that being different did not mean being alone. As the sun set behind the Wyoming hills, Joseph stood beneath the new sign, with the blue blanket wrapped around his shoulders, and the turquoise pendant shining faintly against his chest. The wind moved through the grass like a whisper from those who had gone before him. He smiled then, not because every question had been answered, but because the most important one finally had. He knew where he belonged. And for the first time in his life, no one could force him away. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who believes promises still matter. Tell us in the comments, if you had found Captain Reeves's letter, would you have stood beside Joseph even when the whole town was afraid? Your voice helps keep these cowboy stories alive, and we will see you in the next journey from the American frontier.